With me today is Kai Zenner, the Head of Office and Digital Policy Advisor from MEP Axel Voss in the European Parliament. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lukas, for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Before we delve into the specifics of the AI Act and its implementation, I would actually like to turn the page back. The legislative process of the AI Act has been nothing short of a marathon, and there were rapid advancements in AI in itself. New risks have emerged with regards to the AI application. Also, the societal pressure for regulation on AI has increased. And furthermore, the looming shadow of the upcoming European Parliament elections added a strict deadline to finalize the drafting of the law. Do you think that in light of all these pressures and how much did they influence the overall process and the final shape of the law? And do you think that the lawmakers were able to actually thoroughly discuss the articles in context and anticipate some unintended consequences?
It's a very good question that I will reply to in two very different directions. So first of all, I think AI was maybe one of the first digital legislative pieces here coming from the European Union, where the policy makers were really heavily involved, were closely following new developments, and actually included in the AI Act a lot of rather new tools of lawmaking. For example, the strong focus on implementing acts, delegated acts that are connected to articles and annexes, the regulatory sandboxes, all those advisory forums, scientific panels, and so on. And all of that, and of course also the strong focus on harmonized standards in Article 40 with the presumption of conformity, all those points we included in a way to make the legislative piece more future-proof and make it easy to adjust it. A delegated act could pass the whole process of drafting it, presenting it, and getting the yes or no from the Parliament and Council in 6 months, for example. And with all those steps, we and our bosses kind of anticipated that AI is changing very fastly, and we saw it with GPI and generative AI, as you said, that even in the discussions there were new topics that the Commission and also the Parliament didn't think about. So this is a good thing, and I think again the co-legislators learned a lot and improved a little bit the legislative process and the lawmaking per se. On the negative side, indeed, there was a lot of pressure from the society, from companies, but I would say most of this pressure was coming from within the EU institutions. It was a useless pressure that there was not really a reason for. And it led to a situation that, all political groups, especially the shadows, were constantly hearing, you need to accept it. We cannot wait anymore. Everyone wants the AI Act. There is a European election. No one knows what happens afterwards, and so on and so on. And this, indeed, as you indicated in your question, led to a situation that many things have not been discussed properly. Some parts of the AI Act have not even been discussed at all. And on big changes like the one on generative AI, we had a situation that the co-rapporteurs decided to discuss it only at the very end of the trialogue, which led to a situation that we received in this marathon political trialogue from the 6th to the 8th of December, 4 or 5 new versions how to regulate general purpose AI models, and were then confronted to give a feedback in 20 minutes. And somehow it was, at least the first 2 versions were completely new approaches, completely new text. And this Axel and I, and this view is shared by a lot of other shadow rapporteurs, like, for example, Svenja Hahn. are really still furious about. This is not the way how you should do laws. And the results we are seeing now, the AI Act has a lot of good elements, but it has also a lot of extremely vague and unclear procedures, definitions, and so on.
Indeed.
And this is, again, the result of bad lawmaking under a lot of time pressure.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very fascinating perspective. And I think that kind of links to my second question, which is I'm actually curious about the lessons learned from this process, because I mean, AI Act is this fundamental piece in the EU's digital strategy together with GDPR. But what do you think are the key takeaways from this legislative journey of the AI
Yeah,
Act that could be applied to digital technologies in
yeah,
general? I think that the appetite for regulating the technologies in the digital sphere is not disappearing, so we can
yeah,
anticipate some more loss in the future.
yeah,
What would you
yeah.
do differently?
My personal opinion, shared by my boss Axel Voss, is that the AI Act shows that horizontal laws that are trying to regulate a technology are not working.
Mhm.
We think that the final result of the AI Act shows that we were right from day number one when we were arguing for maybe having a general principle kind of EU bids of rights, kind of like in the United
Mhm.
States, a Bill of Rights for AI. But those principles would be not yeah, kind of enforceable, or companies would be liable if they are not completely fulfilling those principles. But those principles would be translated in different sectors, because AI in different sectors have different risks, different opportunities, and so on. We really think that we should all learn from this journey that we had now with the AI Act, and maybe focus more like the UK and the US on sectorial legislation. Of course, you can say the AI Act very nicely in the press, in the media, but does it really help our industry, our civil society? Again, even from the civil society point of view, I think it's much better if you address certain risks very, very specific, if you concentrate on a specific risk in a specific use case or sector. This may be as a general point. I think another lesson learned should be really to work as inclusive as possible. I think the AI Act showed several times, if you try to hide from the public, from stakeholders, but even from political players, like in the council, member states didn't know about the text for many months because the presidency didn't share it. We, as shadow rapporteurs and staffers, often receive news or new text via the press. So the press, Euractiv or Politico, had very often documents before ourselves.
Mm.
And my boss is still furious about this point. And we don't think that, again, this is workable. If you want to publish text, then do it completely publicly, that everyone has access. I think especially in topics that are so sophisticated and so complex, like how to regulate AI, also policymakers cannot do it themselves. And actually, it's good to include the public, the experts from outside as much as possible. So this, I think, is really a big lesson learned. I think we should also internally in the European Parliament, in the Commission, in the Council, really rethink our ways of lawmaking. Better regulation principles have not been followed,
Mhm.
at least constantly. And I think we saw on a lot of points, especially now speaking for the Parliament, that our rules of procedure are not really fit anymore to the current practices and the current topics in EU policy. And maybe a last point, and I could go on a long time, but to focus on those 4 points. The fourth point is really that especially in digital legislation. Bruegel and I made this overview of digital pieces for laws, but also for enforcement bodies. We need to be aware that every new law is just one small piece of a very complex legal framework and also enforcement system. And this again means that, yes, we need to speak with experts outside, but we should also speak much more internally, and especially the Commission needs to have a stronger dialogue between different services. There is the inter-service consultation, but in the AI Act, it was not really being used, and this leads to a situation that GDPR, the AI Act are not really coherent, DSA and the AI Act are not coherent, sectorial legislation and the AI Act is not coherent. So the understanding that, again, every new law is one small element of a complex system that needs to be in the end coherent and fit in the whole system is, I think, one of the biggest lessons learned. And I see it with a lot of sympathy, and it makes me feeling a little bit optimistic that at least the services in the Commission are all underlining this point. There seems to be some momentum for the new legislative term and the new Commission to really focus on the enforcement and on the coherence between the laws.
True. I mean, I couldn't agree more on your last point. And this is like straight out of CIPL's playbook. That's
Yes,
something that we highlight a lot. The consistency between these D acts, as we call, and
yeah,
adding AI Act to it is definitely a challenge. And the practical implementation of the ground, taking also different risk assessments and
yes,
sometimes contradictory provisions within those acts. That's very challenging for anyone really, for big and small companies to
exactly,
implement.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah, maybe on that, we cannot, as European Union, always say that we want to protect SMEs and startups and promote their growth and so
True.
on and so on, because we all know a large US tech company also struggles to become compliant with the AI Act, with Cyber Resilience Act, and so on and so on. But in the end, they have the staff, they have the financial means, and so on to become compliant after some time. For a small
Mhm.
SME that is now facing this tsunami of digital laws, it's almost impossible, and therefore we are contradicting our political goals to foster our European economy, by
True.
the way we are doing laws. Yeah.
And before we just get into more details on the AI Act, that's something also that you mentioned right now. So even though AI Act is a product safety legislation, it does touch upon fundamental rights
Yes.
protection. Do you
Yes.
think that the AI Act at the end managed to strike the good balance between the fundamental rights protection and innovation and product safety?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. As I said, Axel and I completely disagree with the way the AI Act has been written. We
Mhm.
wanted an AI Bills of Rights and sectorial legislation or adjustment. So for us, using NLF, the product safety approach for the AI policy is already wrong, because one of our example is this key element of NLF legal frameworks of substantial modification. For example, in our view, doesn't work with AI because an
Mhm.
evolving system is constantly doing substantial modification. And there are a lot of things, like also a risk-based approach is nice. Companies want it, but are we really sure that an AI system that is placed in a certain risk category is staying there forever? Especially now with foundation models and so on, or really sophisticated deep learning systems. Again, they are even faster evolving, so maybe they are changing risk categories or adding risk categories. So in the end, conceptually, we had, or we still have, huge problems with the choice of the Commission to use NLF. And I think the point that you were mentioning, to add, so because it's not only product safety. It's a hybrid of product safety and fundamental rights protection, as you rightfully underlined. And this makes it even worse because NLF as a system, at least, is completely understood by everyone in the European Union and is one of the reasons why our internal market is working quite well. But now the fundamental rights protection as an addition in the system is, I think, overcomplicating everything, is confusing a lot of players, and a lot of established mechanism, at least for some years, will not work smoothly anymore. For example, now that standardization organizations need to certainly talk about fundamental right elements, is really difficult. Since Senelec is telling us that in many points they cannot really deliver. Then there's this big question if the Commission is then adding a lot of common specifications. With that maybe also disturbing the whole working NLF system. And we have also, a lot of, let's say, unclear new things like the fundamental right impact assessment that maybe is also difficult to implement for those actors that need to do it. And also in the enforcement side or governance side, again, we have an NLF system that in itself was working, but now with all those new actors like the Fundamental Rights Agency, like the EDPB and the data protection, like national data protection authorities, there are a lot of new players that don't understand NLF, that are not used to the system, and the NLF system is also not used to those actors. And to mix it, in the end, in our view, at least for the next 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 years, will create a complete chaos. Maybe this chaos, similar to GDPR, is solving itself after some time, but at least for the beginning, because of this mix, we are expecting huge legal uncertainty. So in our view, back to your question, it's probably not working, but it was not the fault of the trialogue or of the co-legislator. It's really going back to the original decision of the Commission to use NLF for AI and to integrate fundamental rights protection in it.
That's an interesting perspective, even though I hope that somehow we will avoid the chaos. That would
I
be
hope
great.
I'm wrong. Yeah.
But since you mentioned standards, I think it's a good time to turn to the practical side of things. The implementation phase is very crucial for the AI Act success. So in terms of thinking for companies, for example, navigating these waters, what are the 5 most important steps that the company should take in order to prepare for the AI Act's enforcement?
Yeah. So all those negativities that I was now mentioning, again, we think it's very likely that at least some years of legal uncertainty is coming, but due to another effect that I already mentioned, all those modern ways of lawmaking, modern elements like regulatory sandboxes that we as co-legislator added, companies also have now a huge responsibility, but even more a huge chance to make the system work. So my negative scenario doesn't need to play out like this if now companies, or the majority of companies, are heavily engaging with the co-legislators or with the enforcement bodies on different levels. To your 5 points that you were asking me for. First of all, every company right now should really make an in-depth analysis, assessment, if they are really using AI or thinking they use AI, because many companies are not really aware, and AI is also hidden often. For example, a small safety component is AI, but the whole rest of the software system is rather traditional software. So companies, first of all, really need to understand, are we covered? Are we falling in the scope of the AI Act? If they do, Of course, they should use CIPL, they should use trade associations, they should use other network, because I really believe the more companies are working together, the better it is, because they can share best practices. You and other, let's call it platforms, can also help to coordinate, help to push certain points forward, and so on and so on. So really partner up, join alliances, and so on, and then together try to become slowly compliant as a second point. Maybe the next 3 points that I will say are really concrete actions that companies can do based on those new ways of lawmaking that we included. First of all, I mentioned already the presumption of conformity in Article 40. If companies in the future are building an AI system based on technical harmonized standards, they benefit from this presumption. They don't have any extra cost, any extra steps. So it's a really cheap way in the end to get compliance. But what is needed is that companies are engaging stronger in national and in the European standardization organizations and CENELEC, because what we hear is that so far US, American, and Chinese companies are, even in Europe, heavily dominating the standardization process, and of course larger companies. I know that for small companies it's sometimes tricky, it's too expensive, it's tricky to get access, and so on. But if the European AI standards should work in the end, they really need feedback from smaller market players. Another point, very similar, are those guidelines that the European Commission will now provide in Article 82A, but also in Article 6.2a, and so on. The Commission is tasked with, for example, writing down a kind of table of what is AI, what is not AI, what is high risk, what is not high risk, what is a substantial modification, and so on. The Commission, key and gross unit, is very small. They are heavily overworked, and they really need the help of stakeholders, civil society, academics, companies, to provide them with use cases, with concrete feedback. Companies should use this chance to, again, engage more with the Commission, with national competent authorities. And the final and fifth point is make use of the new mechanism, like the regulatory sandboxes, where you can enter a really, really concrete dialogue with the enforcement body, and yeah, on both sides have some kind of regulatory learning, which then could transform in, for example, a new delegated act, some adjustments in standardization level, on guidelines level, and so on. And at a similar instance, also use the scientific panel, the advisory forum now in the AI Act, because not only in the regulatory sandbox there is this exchange, but also in all those new advisory bodies that we added in the AI Act to foster the exchange between public and private sector. I think if companies are doing all those steps together, which are going much more in the direction, as I said, a second point, to work together, not only within the industry, but also with the regulator, then my negative scenario might not become true, and companies together with the Commission and others are managing to let's say, clarify all those legal uncertainties that we have right now with the text.
That's
So
a
it's
great
really an
point.
ecosystem that needs to be built now.
Indeed. I really like your point. I think that the AI Act indeed could be that point of, allowing meaningful regulatory engagement between, the regulator and the companies, because I mean, the issues that, companies will be experiencing won't be solely for large companies. And I don't even think that large companies will have an easier time solving, for example, the clash between data minimization principle and, within GDPR and AI Act. So the regulatory engagement will be key for everybody.
Exactly.
And now turning back to the negative side of the AI Act again, what do you think are the provisions that will be the most challenging to implement in practice?
Yeah, I mentioned already substantial modification.
Indeed.
I think this will become extremely tricky. I was on Tuesday at a conference in London speaking with a lot of really deep learning experts with PhDs, so really those technical people. And they are saying, look, well, we don't know how it's being interpreted, but actually our systems change every day, every minute, kind of. Does it mean we need to do a new conformity assessment internally
Mm-hmm.
or externally? Do we need to update our technical documentation non-stop, and so on and so on? This, well, the Commission again needs to clarify it. One option would be that they kind of change the understanding of substantial modification in a way that only really big changes, like you make the AI system learn a complete new capability,
Mm-hmm.
task, and so on, that only that triggers a substantial modification. Then I don't know if, let's say, the objective to have is a very strong fundamental rights protection is still being met, and the whole or several other objectives of the AI Act. So yeah, and the other option would be to keep it rather narrow, this definition, which would mean then indeed that companies basically need to constantly work on their
Mm-hmm.
compliance, which would mean really high cost. And for smaller companies, actually probably would lead to the decision that investing in AI is too expensive. This plays forth with basically the whole Article 3. Many of those definitions are not really
Mm-hmm.
clear. Yes, new guidelines will come, like the one on the AI definition, but even with those guidelines, we are really afraid that definitions are too vague in the AI Act. Also, the procedures, even, yeah, you know that I was fighting very strongly for foundation model regulation and GPI regulation, but the procedures that we have there now for example, designating a systemic GPI model, in my opinion, are not in line with European law standards. The rights of the defendant, so to say, so a company like OpenAI, I think are too limited. There are certain things missing that the DSA or DMA are providing for those
Mm-hmm.
companies, and this will be probably attacked. Another point is that, again, the governance system um, didn't, well, we improved it a little bit, but it didn't really learn from GDPR problems. And
Mm-hmm.
again, we have now this situation that you are mixing NLF with other kinds of enforcement. And we will have a situation that different member states have different agencies in charge of AI. In France, it will be very likely the Data Protection Authority. In Germany, the kind of telco agency. In Scandinavia, maybe cybersecurity. And those agencies or those authorities have complete different ways to look on AI, which is clear. As Data Protection Authority, you have privacy in mind. Cybersecurity has security in mind. And again, those things will lead, in our opinion, to so high legal uncertainty that it means that compliance becomes more and more tricky, more and more expensive. And in the end, what the AI Act wanted to do, it didn't want to promote innovation. It didn't want to promote, I don't know, digital skills in AI, nothing like that. The only objective of the AI Act was to build up an ecosystem of trust with a clear legal framework that is bringing legal certainty. And
Mm-hmm.
if we are measuring the AI Act on its only objective, I think it failed, because again, if I'm right, if Axel is right, at least in the first years, it will be a rather legal chaos, and therefore, yeah, not fulfillment of the goal that the AI Act was trying to achieve. Again, we can maybe with a very strong action on the side of companies, on the side of civil society, trying to mitigate all those problems, and yeah, try to improve the law on the so-called level 2, again via guidelines, via standards, and so on and so on. Maybe then it's not coming to this negative scenario, but let's say the text is really not living up to the standards that the European Union should have.
I see.
And this is
So
making Axel and myself really sad, because after all this time we invested, and let's say there was a huge opportunity to really create a not perfect law, but a very good law. And it's sad that there are still a lot of good elements, but this vagueness, this legal uncertainty, this over complexity, those points are so strong that it severely hampers, I think, the AI Act implementation, and decrease the quality of the whole law. And this is just very sad.
I completely understand your concerns, but at the same time, it seems that you and Axel will still have a lot of work to do in the
Yes.
implementation stages of the AI Act and in the
Yes.
new Parliament mandate. And to wrap up the conversation, I think my last question would be, since we already mentioned the European Commission's guidelines, which will be instrumental in bringing the legislation to life. Beyond these guidelines, do you anticipate any further legislative initiatives in the new Commission's term when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Yeah. Well, many people are thinking about that point right now. My feeling, based on all the talks that I had, and also the presentations from the European Commission, or announcements that I heard, I think on AI, and it's a good thing, there's not a lot of appetite to do now AI Act number 2, or a lot of sectorial AI or topical AI pieces, except maybe two. One point, or one direction was already decided by the Commission when they proposed the AI liability directive. The European Parliament and the Council, I think, did a very smart thing that should receive a lot of applaud from outside, that they stopped the negotiation while the PLD and the AI Act were still being discussed. But now that both are almost finalized, yeah, both co-legislators need to decide if there is still a legal gap when it comes to liability and AI. And if we find so, then of course, in the next legislative term, we will start to discuss the AI liability directive. On top, I think, and as far as I understood Renate Nicolai on some panels and similar statements informally, but also publicly, I think the Commission is really heavily looking in the copyright field. As you know, the AI Act is not really solving the issues that we can see, for example, in the legal proceeding initiated by New York Times against OpenAI in the US, but also with stability in the UK, and so on and so on. It is just making a reference to the text and data mining article of the copyright directive and making a few additional points, but it's not a real solution. I have the strong feeling that we will probably see either a very small and narrow new legislative piece that is trying to solve in legislative terms all those questions when it comes to generative AI and copyright and protected content, or we will even see an update of the recently adopted copyright directive. But then it would be also very likely an very specific update, for example, only Article 4 of the Copyright Directive would be reopened. One of those 2 points I think is highly likely. On top of that, yeah, there is this remote chance that we see something on promoting innovation in AI, even though I think the Commission lacks a little bit the competences there, because the EU treaties are giving them mostly to member states. And maybe a remote chance, especially if we see more use of AI from the military or in security field now with the Ukraine war or with the Palestine war and so on, that there is maybe something also in this field, even though there it has the same challenge that most of the competences are in the member states and not on the European level. But beyond those 4 topics, I don't really see the appetite, let's say, for new legislation in AI, which is per se, for us at least, a good thing, because we think now with all those laws, we should really focus on building up a coherent system at first before we are now putting more and more numbers up.
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, there are enough of D files already. So
Exactly.
anyways, it was a very enlightening conversation, Kai, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today. Thank you.
Thank you.